In the United Kingdom, a quiet crisis is unfolding inside one of the country's most recognisable institutions. The BBC, a broadcaster that has shaped British culture for generations, is now facing a financial shortfall so large that MPs say the organisation is under severe pressure. What is happening behind the scenes is more than an accounting problem. It reflects a dramatic shift in how people are consuming content, how households interact with the BBC, and whether the current system of funding public broadcasting can even survive the next decade. According to a new report by the Cross-Party Public Accounts Committee, the BBC is losing more than £1 billion a year in potential licence fee revenue. This isn't an estimate pulled from thin air. It is based on BBC accounts, household data, and enforcement records. For a broadcaster already navigating falling TV viewership, intense competition from global streaming giants, and questions about its leadership, this warning comes at the worst possible time for the corporation. The report states plainly that the corporation is facing unprecedented levels of evasion and non-payment. The BBC is now losing more than £1 billion a year from households either evading the licence fee or deciding they do not need one, according to a cross-party group of MPs who warned the corporation is under severe pressure. Attempts to enforce payment of the licence fee are also stalling. The number of visits to unlicensed homes increased by 50% last year, but it did not translate into either higher sales or successful prosecutions. BBC executives have said they face the increasing problem of householders simply refusing to answer the door. The Commons Public Accounts Committee said the BBC was not doing enough to enforce the collection of the licence fee, which it said was unfair to the vast majority of households who do pay for a licence. Its analysis of BBC accounts found that the licence fee evasion rate is now at 12.5%, costing it up to £550 million. The number of households to state they have no need for a licence because they do not consume BBC content has risen from 2.4 million in 2021 to 3.6 million this year. That equates to a loss of up to £670 million from potential fees. This is not a small gap. This is a structural problem that could reshape what the BBC is able to produce in the years ahead. Part of the issue is that traditional methods of enforcing the licence fee simply don't work the way they used to. The BBC increased physical enforcement efforts dramatically, but with very little return. Attempts to enforce payment of the licence fee are also stalling. The number of visits to unlicensed homes increased by 50% last year, but it did not translate into either higher sales or successful prosecutions. In other words, a more aggressive enforcement strategy is failing in real time. One of the most surprising findings is that fewer people are even opening the door. Field agents can knock, but households are increasingly unresponsive. This makes the old enforcement model instantly outdated. In a world where most content is accessed digitally, and where many viewers no longer feel tied to a traditional TV licence, physical checks are becoming pointless. The numbers behind these losses are staggering. The evasion rate now sits at 12.5%, costing the BBC up to £550 million annually. But the bigger problem may be the millions of households who legally declare they do not need a licence because they do not watch BBC content. As the article states, the number of households to state they have no need for a licence because they do not consume BBC content has risen from 2.4 million in 2021 to 3.6 million this year. That equates to a loss of up to £617 million from potential fees. This is not a small cultural shift. It is proof that the way people watch content has changed forever. Even after making nearly 2 million visits to unlicensed homes, prosecutions are falling. The article highlights the trend. Despite making nearly 2 million visits to unlicensed homes last year, prosecutions fell by 17% in 2024. The BBC is facing critical government talks over the future of the licence fee as it negotiates the renewal of its charter. It does so amid turmoil at the top of the corporation after the resignation of its Director General, Tim Davie. He resigned as a result of criticism about how an episode of Panorama edited a Donald Trump speech. The BBC is not facing this financial crisis in a vacuum. The corporation has been under an intense international spotlight in recent months, triggered by a major controversy that began when The Telegraph first reported that an episode of Panorama had edited a Donald Trump speech in a way that misrepresented his remarks. The BBC doctored a Donald Trump speech by making him appear to encourage the Capitol Hill riot, according to an internal whistleblowing memo seen by The Telegraph. A Panorama programme, broadcast a week before the US election, completely misled viewers by showing the president telling supporters he was going to walk to the Capitol with them to fight like hell, when in fact he said he would walk with them to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard.
And I'll be there with you, and we fight. We fight like hell. We're going to walk down to the Capitol, and we're going to cheer on our brave senators and congressmen and women.
The mangled footage was highlighted in a 19-page dossier on BBC Bias, which was compiled by a recent member of the corporation's Standards Committee and is now circulating in government departments. The fallout was immediate and severe. As public pressure mounted, the BBC's Director General, Tim Davie, resigned, a dramatic moment for an organisation already wrestling with financial uncertainty and declining public trust. His departure was soon followed by additional resignations from senior editorial staff involved in overseeing the programme. What began as a single disputed edit became a symbol of something much larger. The fear that parts of the BBC may not be upholding the standards of accuracy and neutrality that the public expects from the national broadcaster. This controversy hit at the worst possible time. The BBC is currently negotiating its charter renewal, a legally required process that determines how the corporation will be governed and funded for the next decade. When a broadcaster is attempting to secure its future, the last thing it needs is a scandal that shakes public confidence and invites political scrutiny. But that is exactly what has happened. As a result, the BBC now finds itself fighting on multiple fronts, defending its editorial integrity, rebuilding trust after high-profile resignations, and trying to explain how it has lost more than £1 billion in potential licence fee revenue. The combinations of financial crisis and credibility crisis has created one of the most challenging moments in the corporation's modern history. There is also a growing cultural challenge. Younger generations, the very audiences the BBC needs to survive, are increasingly turning to online platforms such as YouTube, TikTok, and streaming services. Children are now heading to YouTube from the moment they turn on the television, in the latest sign of the video platform's migration from the laptop to the living room. YouTube is the most popular first TV destination for Generation Alpha, according to a comprehensive survey of the UK's viewing habits by Ofcom, the communications regulator. 1 in 5 young TV viewers aged from 4 to 15 turned straight to the platform last year. The survey showed Netflix close behind. While BBC One was in the top 5 first destinations, children were just as likely to choose BBC iPlayer. YouTube's increasing presence on televisions is not just down to the very young. In a gradual cultural shift, viewers aged 55 and over watched almost twice as much YouTube content last year as they did in 2023, up from 6 minutes a day to 11 minutes a day. An increasing proportion of that, 42%, is viewed through a TV set. Critics of the license fee say it has become harder to justify as viewers increasingly consume digital platforms such as YouTube and TikTok, which are particularly popular with younger audiences. This is the most significant generational content shift in decades, and it cuts straight to the heart of the debate about how the BBC should be funded. Critics argue that platforms like YouTube, Netflix, Disney Plus, and TikTok have demonstrated that it is entirely possible to produce high-quality, highly engaging content without requiring the public to pay a mandatory annual fee. These platforms succeed because they create content people actively choose to watch. Their revenue comes from two simple sources: audience attention and audience choice. In other words, viewers decide with their clicks, their subscriptions, and their watch time which content deserves to be financially supported. If a platform produces something audiences don't want, it fails, and it has no guaranteed income to fall back on. For critics, this is the key point. These digital platforms survive and profit purely because they offer content that millions of people want to engage with. They don't rely on legal enforcement, penalty letters, or the threat of fines. They rely on relevance. This comparison creates a difficult backdrop for the BBC. Younger generations are asking why they should be required to pay for a system designed in the 1940s, when almost every other form of media is now based on choice, competition, and on-demand consumption. Critics argue that the license fee model looks increasingly outdated in a world where content that fails to attract audiences simply disappears, instead of being funded indefinitely. This cultural shift isn't happening on the margins. It is structural, generational, and accelerating. Every year that passes, more viewers migrate to platforms that must earn their income by producing content people actively value. And the more that happens, the harder it becomes for the BBC to defend a funding model that does not operate on those same competitive principles. Supporters of the license fee, however, argue that this shift towards market-driven content is precisely why the BBC remains essential. They warn that relying solely on commercial pressure, clicks, algorithms, and subscription battles would fundamentally change the type of content available to the public. Platforms like YouTube, Netflix, and TikTok certainly succeed by producing what audiences want, but supporters say the BBC's duty has always been to produce what audiences need. That includes investigative journalism, children's education, public service broadcasting, emergency reporting, regional news, documentaries, and arts programming, genres that are not always profitable but are crucial for an informed society. Yet even this core argument has been weakened in recent weeks. After the BBC was found to have doctored a Donald Trump speech in a Panorama episode, a case that led to the resignation of the Director General and senior editorial staff, critics say the corporation has undermined that very trust and impartiality that justify its special funding model. Supporters have long claimed that the licence fee protects the BBC's independence, allowing it to operate without commercial or political pressure. But the Trump speech controversy has raised uncomfortable questions about whether the BBC is still fulfilling that responsibility. The BBC now faces a significant external threat, a potential multi-billion-dollar lawsuit from US President Donald Trump. Donald Trump's decision to pursue legal action against the BBC is not an isolated move. It fits into a long pattern of aggressively challenging media outlets he believes have misrepresented him. Following the Panorama controversy, Trump has insisted he will still sue the BBC despite its apology, signalling that he intends to seek billions in damages. For his supporters, this is a justified response to what they see as deliberate manipulation. For critics, it is another example of Trump using the courts as a political weapon. Either way, The threat adds yet another layer of pressure on the BBC at a moment when its financial model and editorial standards are already under intense scrutiny. Trump also has a long history of suing news organisations. In recent years, he has launched, or attempted to launch, lawsuits against several major outlets. He sued CNN for $475 million over statements describing his election claims as lies. He sued The Washington Post on multiple occasions, including over opinion pieces he argued were defamatory. He also filed a lawsuit against the New York Times and his niece, Mary Trump, over the publication of his tax documents. Though many of these cases were dismissed or withdrawn, they illustrate a broader pattern. Trump is no stranger to taking media organizations to court. But the deeper message running through all of this is unavoidable. The BBC is no longer dealing with isolated problems. It is confronting a structural shift that touches every part of its operation. And this is where the heart of the issue becomes unmistakable. The BBC has been sent a major warning, not from the critics on the sidelines, but from MPs who say the entire funding system is no longer working. Their message cuts through all the noise. If the BBC doesn't adapt now, the licence fee model, and perhaps the institution built upon it, may not survive. MP Geoffrey Clifton Brown, chair of the Public Accounts Committee, offered one of the strongest warnings. He said, "Our report makes clear that the ground is shifting beneath the BBC's feet. The traditional enforcement method of household visits is seeing fewer and fewer returns at a time of heightened competition for almost every aspect of the BBC's activities. This reflects the biggest challenge. The BBC is fighting to remain relevant in an environment defined by limitless content." Clifton Brown also issued a warning about the future of the licence fee itself. Without a modernised approach focused more on online viewing, the broadcaster will see faith in the licence fee system ebb away. In other words, either the model evolves or it dies. The BBC responded to the report by acknowledging that change is necessary. Their spokesperson made it clear that the corporation is open to reform, but only if it preserves the BBC's universal mission. The licence fee needs reform. We are actively exploring all options that can make our funding model fairer, more modern, and more sustainable. But we've been clear that any reform must safeguard the BBC as a universal public broadcaster. This suggests the BBC is preparing for significant structural change. The question is no longer if change is coming, but whether the BBC can keep pace with it. For more in-depth breakdowns from Eureka, hit like, comment, and subscribe.